All right, so as an analyst, you know your job isn't just to figure out what an organization is, it's to predict what it's going to do. In this explainer, we're going to give you a really powerful new framework, one that goes way beyond those static org charts to actually forecast an organization's next move, and maybe even find its exact breaking point.
So here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll talk about why the old way of doing things is kind of flawed. Then we'll get into the core of this new approach, something called resource mobilization. We'll dig into the huge difference between moral and material resources, see how an organization's very structure shapes its strategy, and then we'll bring it all together to show you how to forecast fragility and create intelligence that's actually actionable. Before we can build a better model, we have to see what's wrong with the old one. So let's start with that traditional blueprint that, let's be honest, most of us were taught to use. You've seen this a million times, right? The classic org chart. It's this neat little pyramid, shows the whole chain of command. It gives you a clean, simple snapshot of the formal structure. But as you're about to see, that simplicity, well, that's its biggest problem. Yeah, here's the thing. This picture, it doesn't move. It's like looking at a skeleton. It tells you nothing about how an organization lives and breathes, how it adapts to survive, and this is the important part, what it takes to actually break it. It just doesn't show you its metabolism, its real vulnerabilities, or its potential to change. To get to that predictive power we're all after, we have to make a pretty fundamental shift in our thinking. See, the old way was just descriptive. It focused on why a group exists, pointing to big picture stuff like inequality. This new approach, though, it's predictive. It focuses on how a group actually functions by treating it like a living thing, a system that needs to take in resources just to survive and act. Okay, so let's pop the hood and look at the engine of this new analysis. The framework is called resource mobilization theory. The main idea here is actually pretty simple. For a second, just forget about ideology, forget about structure. An organization's ability to do anything at all, to recruit, to operate, to even exist, it all comes down to one thing, its ability to get and use resources. Bottom line, no resources, no action. It's that simple. So think of these 5 categories as the different kinds of fuel for that engine. You've got material, that's the obvious stuff, cash, weapons, safe houses. But the others are just as vital. Moral resources, that's all about legitimacy and support. Social organizational is the actual network, the glue holding it all together. Human resources are the people, their skills, their bodies. And finally, cultural resources are the ideas, the shared knowledge, the ideology itself. If you can track the flow of all 5, you suddenly have an incredible analytical advantage. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The ways groups go about collecting these different resources can be totally different. And to see what I mean, let's look at a case study of some radical leftist groups from back in the 70s. For groups like the Weathermen, getting their hands on moral resources, things like legitimacy and solidarity, was absolutely everything. Their whole identity was driven by this radical commitment that demanded they take physical action and sacrifice themselves for the cause. For them, the act of being militant wasn't just a means to an end. It was the resource they were generating. It proved their commitment both to themselves and to anyone watching. And this just highlights this incredible conflict, right? On one hand, their moral resources were built on these huge symbolic acts of revolution. But their material resources? They came from a much, much grittier place. Stealing from grocery stores, begging from friends, living on nothing but noodles. It was a completely different world from the grand ideals they were fighting for. So you have to ask, what kept people in the fight? I mean, the material rewards were obviously awful. But check out this chart. The psychological rewards were through the roof. That feeling of belonging, that moral certainty, the admiration from your peers, this psychological return on investment was the real currency here. It was the key to recruiting people and keeping them loyal. Okay, let's add another layer to this. How does the actual shape of an organization, whether it's a rigid pyramid or a flexible network, change how it goes about gathering all these resources? So you've basically got 2 models. On one side, the classic top-down pyramid. On the other, a decentralized network of independent cells. Now, these are fundamentally different ways of getting things done, and each one has some very unique strengths and, what we really care about, some very critical weaknesses when it comes to managing resources. A pyramid is nothing if not efficient. Control is centralized, which is great for managing money and big, complex logistics.
But that strength, it's also its biggest vulnerability. You take out the leadership, what we call a decapitation strike, and the whole thing can just fall apart. A network, well, it's messy. It's harder to command. But it is incredibly resilient. You can knock out one node, and the rest of the network just finds a way to keep on going.
And this right here is a really key difference. A network builds its moral and social support from the bottom up. It draws from a wide, scattered community of sympathizers. A pyramid does the exact opposite. It hammers its ideology down from the top through a very rigid chain of command. And here is a super important connection for you to see. How a group builds its moral resources directly impacts who it's able to recruit. Pyramids tend to attract people who want that clear hierarchy or drawn to a strong leader. Networks, on the other hand, attract people who are drawn to the idea itself, people who want autonomy. So for an analyst, just watching how a group recruits gives you massive clues about its hidden structure. So now we can start combining these two ideas, resources and structure. And this, right here, is how we make the leap from just describing an organization to actually forecasting what it's going to do and identifying its precise breaking points. So let's run a little simulation. Let's see how this plays out when things get tough. Imagine a major external shock. Let's say their main source of funding gets shut down. What happens? Well, in a pyramid, the leadership is going to tighten its grip to protect itself, and that rigidity often becomes its fatal flaw. But in a network, individual cells are forced to innovate, to find new funding on their own. The organization as a whole adapts, and it survives. Now, here is a critical indicator that you, as an analyst, can actually watch for. Every organization just wants to survive, right? That's its primary drive. But in a crisis, this drive can create something called cognitive dissonance. The things a group has to do to survive start to directly contradict its core ideology. And when you spot that conflict, that clash between survival and belief, you've found a major stress fracture. Okay, so let's pull all these pieces together into a practical tool, something you can actually use in your next briefing. Think of this matrix as your cheat sheet for dynamic forecasting. It shows you which structure has the edge in different scenarios, and this is the most important part, it tells you exactly what indicators to watch for. For instance, in a long conflict, a pyramid is better for big operations, but your key indicator becomes any disruption in its material resources. A network will survive longer, but you've got to be watching its propaganda, its moral resource inputs, for any sign that the ideology is starting to fracture. So, let's end on a question that really puts this whole framework to the test. You see a group's funding get cut off. At the same time, their propaganda starts to shift. They're talking less about attacking external enemies and more about internal purity. So, is that a network adapting to survive, or is that the cognitive dissonance of a rigid pyramid under stress, one that's about to collapse? By tracking the flow of all 5 resources, you can now answer that question. And that is the difference between reporting what already happened and predicting what's going to happen next.